Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue dans En coulisses. Je vous reçois cette semaine en plein cœur de San Francisco, à Union Square. Nous sommes dans un lieu mythique de la gastronomie locale, dans le restaurant de Michael Mina. Et cette semaine, nous sommes en compagnie de Lincoln. Lincoln Carson, c'est le chef exécutif de Michael Mina depuis plus de 7 années. C'est lui qui met en place tous les desserts, qui les crée et qui diffuse ce savoir-faire auprès de toutes ses équipes. It's a great pleasure, Lincoln. Today is your kitchen.
Welcome to the kitchen.
Yes. Which is the base of your dessert?
Okay, so today we're using Valrhona Custard.
And why do you like Tahini for this dessert and another one?
You know, the truth is, a lot of times I'll pick the chocolate based on the ingredients that are going with the chocolate.
Yes.
And I like this recipe very much with mangiare, but I thought that it was a little too acidity, too much fruit comparatively. I like the Chinori because of it's a very rich chocolate flavor in this custard. So it pairs very well to balance against the other ingredients. So it's something to think about, the character of each chocolate.
Yes, and you are doing a wonderful mix with toffee, something like that, I saw.
Yeah, we have some black sesame.
You were speaking about that.
Yeah, tahini.
I'll let you speaking about that.
Okay.
Vous verrez d'ailleurs que Lincoln nous parle de custard cream, de crème anglaise. Mais en fait, c'est une crème anglaise qu'il a adaptée pour des raisons bien précises. Et cela, il va vous l'expliquer. Je vous laisse en sa compagnie. Je vous retrouve juste après pour le meilleur moment, la dégustation. Lincoln, thanks a lot, and you are the star.
All right, thank you, Fred. Today I have a very simple recipe that was, for me, a solution to a difficult problem. One of my favorite textures in pastry is custard, typically an egg-based custard. I like the smooth, creamy mouthfeel and the texture. I think it's a great base for many different desserts. The problem is we couldn't bake the custards in an oven, so we had to find a new solution. What I'm featuring today is a custard with Valrhona Custard. However, instead of eggs, we're setting the custard with carrageenan. It's a seaweed-based colloid or gelling agent, and it gives you a very silky, smooth mouthfeel, very similar to what you get with eggs. But we're able to set the custard at room temperature or refrigerated, and we're able to pour many of them very quickly. So it saves time and gives me the texture that I'm looking for. To start, there are several different kinds of carrageenan. Today we are using Kappa carrageenan. It's a very soft texture. In order to properly use it, we need to hydrate it in the liquid at a temperature above 40 degrees Celsius. To incorporate this into our chocolate, I'm essentially making ganache, and then we will be transferring the ganache to a blender to incorporate our carrageenan. So I have my mixture of milk and cream, sugar, and we're just going to heat this on medium heat to incorporate with our already melted chocolate. While we're waiting for our milk, our cream, our sugar to come up to a scald, just to talk a little bit about the reasoning behind the dessert. I like to think of this dessert as, or this particular recipe, as a blank canvas for you to paint on. I'm going to pour it into a glass and make a small tasting portion. It's possible you could make this dessert in a bowl. Use completely different ingredients, even use different chocolates. I like very much this recipe with Valrhona mangiare, but today I felt that the Valrhona Custard was a better match and balance for some of the other components in the dessert. You can do a much larger batch. If you're in a hotel, for example, and you need to do 200, it's no problem. As I'm sure many Valrhona users and chefs are familiar, we have to execute an emulsion. So this is the exact same procedure as making a ganache before we continue with the addition of the carrageenan. So as my liquid is coming up to the proper temperature, for this small recipe, I'm going to use a rubber spatula and add a small portion of cream and milk, and waiting for the texture to start to come together, where you see almost a plastic-like consistency. So for larger quantities of this recipe, I found a large immersion blender to be very helpful in perfecting the emulsion. The combination of high RPM and the ability to put the chocolate and the cream into a small, more enclosed space. I would recommend something maybe a little bit deeper and a little bit tighter in terms of container. You're able to get a very nice emulsion. Okay. All of our liquid is combined with the chocolate. I'm going to finish this with a hand blender. And always make sure when you're using the hand blender that you tap out the air that may be trapped in the bottom of the blender. You can see the texture of this base right now is very, very fluid. So if I were to hope that this would set from the cocoa butter alone, I would have a very, very loose product. We would not have very nice custard. It would be more like soup. So here we have our emulsified chocolate, cream, milk, and sugar. And the proportion is pretty small in sugar, about 50-50, maybe 55% milk to cream. But for me to get the creamy texture, I need to now hydrate the carrageenan. And in order to do that, it requires high RPM shearing, and it also requires the temperature to be correct. Now, for sure, this is hot enough. We've just made this emulsion. It requires 40 degrees Celsius. With a thermometer, this is probably about 75 Celsius currently. It's important that you're careful when you're blending with a hot liquid. If you start too fast, you are going to have a problem with the liquid coming up and out of the blender. It's also very important when using hydrocolloids such as carrageenan, and there are a whole list of others. We're using such a small percentage that you use a very, very accurate scale. The measurement for this is 3.9 grams. If you use 3.8 grams or 4 grams, it's a very different product. So in my blender, I have the hot emulsified cream, milk, sugar, and chocolate. Very important that you start this out slowly so that it doesn't come up and out of the blender. So just for safety, we'll start with the lid on top, and then I'll remove it to add the carrageenan. Part of this process requires that you create a vortex where the liquid is sucking down to the blades, and you have a place where you can add the carrageenan without it sitting on the surface of the liquid. So you need to get enough speed in the blender to be able to accomplish that. You can see that we've created a vortex where there is very clear suction down to the blade, and I'm going to not add this all at one time, but very carefully tap into that vortex. And as the texture changes, I may have to add more speed. So pay attention to what's happening inside the machine. It is possible for larger batch, again, to use a very powerful immersion blender. The other possibility is if, for example, I was doing a 2 times batch or double this quantity, I can hydrate all of my carrageenan in this amount of liquid and then combine this liquid with the remaining liquid. So the carrageenan will continue to hydrate and gel regardless of being added to a larger quantity of liquid. I'm going to put the cover on, and I'm going to bring the speed up a little bit higher. So it's the high RPM action of the blades actually helping to hydrate the hydrocolloid or the carrageenan. And it's important that we shear it for a period of time, approximately 30 seconds. So one of the more interesting things about using carrageenan is you will notice as soon as you have it hydrated and above 40 degrees Celsius, it's going to begin to set. And if we take a look, this has been transferred to this container for maybe 1 minute, and you can see we already have gelification. There are 2 things happening here. We have cocoa butter, which we need to make sure is fluid in making the ganache and keeping it at a proper temperature. And then we have the carrageenan. In order for the cocoa butter to set, we have to bring it down below its fusion point. So we'll set this in the refrigerator. The carrageenan doesn't require the temperature to drop too far for it to set. So while the cocoa butter is thermo-reversible, the carrageenan is not. But the carrageenan is shear reversible. So if we wanted to use this appareil again, and I have some already made previously, I would warm this in order to melt the cocoa butter. So we warm it to 45 to 50 Celsius. And then in order to break the gel of the carrageenan, I need to shear it with either a hand blender, an immersion blender, or just a standard blender. Then you're able to pour, and it will start to set almost immediately again. So in order to pour this, I will use the immersion blender. Again, make sure you get the air out from underneath. and bring the custard to a fluid state. At this point, we'll pour our desired amount, which is approximately 75 grams. As you can see, the texture of the custard has changed significantly simply from the addition of the 3.9 grams of carrageenan. It's a very small amount. It's very strong. You can see the texture of the carrageenan from several minutes ago. It's almost set. However, the cocoa butter is going to require a little more time and lower temperature in order to properly set and get the same texture. You could have a warm custard, might be interesting, but for our purposes, we were trying to create a dessert that we could set ahead of time. This custard was set maybe 3 or 4 hours ago. I have sponge cake, which was made with sesame oil. It's a very nice, light, soft crumb, very moist with the addition of sesame and grapeseed oil. And to cut, cuts very cleanly. I will be using a milk chocolate cremeux we made with Jabari Lacté from Valrhona. And we used a white tahini paste in the recipe. So we have a very earthy flavor. Obviously, the sesame with the sesame oil is the theme. And then part of the garnish will have black sesame seeds for another dimension of the sesame flavor. In order to keep everything from moving around too much, I will use the cremeux to hold the cake in place and to bring up some height in the glass. I'm just piping small spikes. We'll garnish with an English toffee. It has the addition of black sesame seeds that were toasted in the toffee. And I like the opposing textures of crunchy, creamy, the soft cake, and really what this thing was built on, the custard on the bottom. So speaking of the dessert visually for me, I think it's important, you know, I spoke of a blank canvas with the custard, something that you can build upon. For me, it's a nice flat open area that I can have very sharp, jagged shapes from the toffee. I can have very soft organic shapes from the tahini cremeux. I have the very structured shapes of the cake. And I'm going to finish with one of my favorite flavors in the world, bourbon whiskey. So we've made bourbon whiskey cordial, which is a very old technique using a cornstarch mold. I'm brushing the excess cornstarch off of the cordial. You can see we have a very nice shape. It's a little bit translucent, and we have the fluid bourbon syrup inside. Our Valrhona custard.
And I just said when the tasting will be ready, I just go back. I love your style, Lincoln, because you said I don't like to do something so much organized. It was a great time, Lincoln, yeah. And I really appreciate all your pedagogy, because we're really feeling that everything is coming from your heart. And on behalf of all the chefs there, I just want to say a real wonderful thank you.
Thank you, Fred. It was a pleasure.
Yes. Eh bien, vous retrouverez tous les détails de cette recette sur le site de Valrhona TV. Pour ma part, je vous dis à très bientôt dans En coulisses. Backstage San Francisco, c'est terminé. Bye bye, à bientôt.